The city of Crestwood was a glittering, arrogant expanse, a place where concrete and glass battled the sky, and fortunes were whispered over expensive Bordeaux. But in the shadow of the Alistair Towers, the world looked different. It was here, in a polished, cavernous establishment called the Gilded Spoon, that Scarlett existed. The air in the Gilded Spoon was thick with the scent of roasted duck, old money, and unspoken disdain. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was a stage for the city's elite, and Scarlett, the quiet waitress with the perpetually tired eyes and the ill-fitting black uniform, was merely part of the scenery, a shadow serving light. She moved through the maze of white tablecloths and crystal like a ghost, her steps practiced and silent, her inner world miles away from the casual cruelty that often characterized her patrons. She was tired, yes, but it was a soul-deep weariness, the kind that settled in your bones when you realized how little the world cared about the struggle. Scarlett was barely 23, but the lines of worry around her eyes suggested a decade more. Her hands, usually hidden by trays and menus, told a story of hard labor and forgotten dreams. She was a woman built of resilience and dust, trying to pay for a ghost of a future she wasn't sure still existed, haunted by a past she couldn't outrun. Her origin, the forgotten side of Crestwood, the factories and the worn-out apartment blocks, was a badge of shame in this gilded setting, a detail the regulars were quick to mock with their overly polite, stinging comments about the help. The silence was the loudest sound she knew. That particular Tuesday evening, the atmosphere was even heavier. A prestigious annual dinner for the Alistair Foundation. The room pulsed with powerful egos, diamond rings catching the light, and the relentless clinking of champagne flutes. Scarlett was stationed near the window, a duty that afforded her a glimpse of the city lights, a beautiful, untouchable tapestry. She was balancing a tray laden with delicate desserts when the laughter erupted at table 7, the centerpiece, the table where the Alistair dynasty held court. One of the younger guests, red-faced with wine and arrogance, had managed to trip Scarlett with an extended foot. The tray tilted, a tower of creme brulee wobbled, then crashed, not onto the floor, but onto the edge of the rich Persian rug, a spectacular mess of custard and crystal. A collective gasp, then a wave of patronizing, low chuckle swept the room. Scarlett's heart pounded, not from fear of being fired, she was already treading water, but from the sheer humiliation. It was the same old story, the elite playing games, the consequences falling solely on the invisible. "Careful, dear," the young man slurred, not apologizing, but adding a condescending, cutting edge to his voice. "Those things are expensive, and unlike you, we actually had to earn them." The mockery was a physical weight. She felt the hot sting of tears welling, a weakness she loathed. She didn't look up, focusing intensely on the broken glass, ready to sink to her knees and start the inevitable, mortifying cleanup. It was the weight of every slight she had ever endured. Then, a presence shifted the entire dynamic of the room. It wasn't loud, but absolute. A man stood up from table 7. He was tall, perfectly tailored, with the kind of gravitas that silenced a crowd instantly, not through fury, but sheer calm authority. This was Jackson Alistair. The name was synonymous with power, untouchable wealth, and a reserved, almost austere public persona. He was the reigning king of Crestwood's financial world, a billionaire who rarely graced the public with his presence, yet his eyes, a striking, deep shade of unsettling gray, held a depth that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. He wasn't looking at the spilled dessert. He wasn't looking at the careless guest. He was looking only at Scarlett. It was the first time she had truly seen him up close. He didn't carry the usual sneer of entitlement. His expression was impossible to read, a quiet intensity that felt unnervingly personal. He slowly, deliberately, walked past the laughing faces, bypassing the ruin on the rug, and stopped directly in front of her. "The dessert can be replaced." His voice was low, a velvet rumble that cut through the lingering chatter. He didn't speak to her, but to the room, to the young man who had caused the incident. "But the carelessness is costly." Then, in a move that froze every breath in the Gilded Spoon, Jackson Alistair, the most powerful man in Crestwood, reached out. He didn't offer a cleaning cloth or a reprimand. He took Scarlett's hand, her rough, work-worn hand, in his own. His grip was firm, warm, and utterly unexpected. It was not a gesture of charity, but of parody, a moment that felt like a quiet, yet seismic, rejection of the entire social structure of the room. His touch was an electric charge, pulling Scarlett from the suffocating haze of her shame. For the first time that night, she lifted her gaze, meeting those deep, unsettling gray eyes. In that silent, shared moment, surrounded by the judging, confused faces of the wealthy, there was a flash of something unreadable in his look, a recognition, perhaps, or a secret pain mirrored in her own. "You don't need to apologize," he murmured, his thumb gently brushing the back of her hand. The words were solely for her, a private decree in a public spectacle. He didn't ask her name, didn't demand an explanation. He simply stood there, holding her hand, challenging the entire room with his silent presence. This simple, radical act of acknowledgement, a billionaire choosing to stand by the side of the mocked waitress, shattered the established order. A tiny, fragile seed of dangerous hope took root in Scarlett's chest. The air crackled with unspoken questions, with dawning suspicion from the onlookers, and with a shocking, profound connection between the two of them. He saw the ghost, and he held her hand. Jackson Alistair slowly released her hand, leaving her palm tingling with a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. He offered her the ghost of a smile, a fleeting, almost melancholic curve of the lips, before turning and resuming his position, the master of the universe once more. But the damage was done. For Scarlett, the world had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer just the invisible help. She was the one the powerful Jackson Alistair had publicly chosen to see. And the question that now thundered in the abrupt silence was not about the spilled dessert, but about the unspoken secret that lay beneath Jackson Alistair's strange, protective gesture. What did he see in her? And what would happen now that he had pulled her from the shadows and into the blinding, dangerous light of his attention? After the incident, the Gilded Spoon transformed. It was still the same room of polished mahogany and cruel whispers, but for Scarlett, a strange filter had been applied to reality. Jackson Alistair's gesture, the simple, grounding touch of his hand, had carved a small, private sanctuary around her. Now, every shift was punctuated by a tension that was both intoxicating and terrifying. He became a fixture, not every night, but frequently enough to make her heart stutter when the door to his private dining area, the reserve, opened. He never summoned her directly. He didn't have to. The head waiter, sensing the shift in the power dynamic, ensured that Scarlett was the one to deliver his solitary espresso or the pre-dinner glass of single malt scotch. Their interactions were brief, silent symphonies of unspoken feeling. The only communication they allowed themselves was through their eyes. In a world where she was accustomed to being looked through, Jackson saw her. His gaze, those deep, unsettling gray pools, was analytical, yet curiously gentle. When he looked at her, the mask of a successful, unapproachable billionaire seemed to soften, revealing a flicker of something profoundly private, almost wounded. She, in turn, offered him only the barest tremor of a smile, a fleeting recognition that vanished before it could be questioned. A glance can be the most forbidden of conversations. The weight of their disparate worlds pressed down on these micro-moments. She was the ghost who served. He was the gilded architect of the city. Their connection was a fragile piece of architecture built on the crumbling foundation of social inequality. Every time she handed him a menu, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second, she felt the stark contrast. Her skin rough from dish soap and long hours, his impeccably smooth, a symbol of effortless existence. The air between them was thick with the knowledge that their closeness was an absurdity, a direct violation of the rules that governed their separate spheres. She learned his routines, his preferences, the exact temperature of his coffee, the way he always left his watch on the table, seemingly impatient with the passage of time. And she suspected he was learning the silent language of her exhaustion, the way her shoulders slumped slightly just before the final rush, the small, almost imperceptible shake of her hand after a particularly demanding shift. One evening, he was engrossed in a financial report, lines of dense text spread across the dark wood table. Scarlett approached to refill his water. As she poured, her gaze lingered for a moment on the column of numbers, millions, billions, a dizzying summary of a world she could never touch. She sighed, a small, involuntary sound of hopelessness. He looked up instantly, catching the tail end of her despair. He didn't speak. Instead, he took a pen from his breast pocket, drew a sharp line across the page of dizzying figures, and then, slowly, deliberately, pushed the report away. He replaced the pen on the table, right next to the column of millions, and pointedly shifted his attention to her. It was a silent, powerful dismissal of his own world in favor of her presence. "What is it you truly want to save?" Jackson asked, his voice barely a breath. It was the first time he had spoken anything other than a polite request since the dessert incident. The question bypassed all small talk, reaching straight for the core of her vulnerability. Scarlett was momentarily stunned. She looked down at the carafe, unable to articulate the burden of her responsibilities, the medical bills for her younger sister, the relentless uphill climb. "I just want to stand still," she managed, the truth a bitter taste on her tongue. "To stop running." A shadow crossed Jackson's eyes, a flash of shared, profound understanding. "We are both running, aren't we, Scarlett?" He didn't use a term of endearment, but the simple, correct pronunciation of her name, rolling off his tongue like a secret, felt like the most intimate whisper. The quiet acknowledgement of shared captivity. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unctuous partner, Mr. Thorne, who greeted Jackson with booming familiarity. As Thorne launched into a self-congratulatory monologue about a recent merger, he cast a dismissive, proprietary glance at Scarlett, who was still standing by the table. "Ah, the charming waitress. Better stick to the water, dear, before you break another vase," Thorne said, his smile radiating false warmth. The air around Jackson Alistair went instantly cold. His jaw tightened, and he didn't even glance at Thorne. He looked straight at Scarlett, his expression hardening into a fierce protectiveness that stole her breath. He waited until Thorne paused for air. "Thorne," Jackson stated, his voice now steel, "I believe there are important documents waiting for your signature at the Foundation office. Now." The dismissal was absolute. Thorne stammered, his false smile dissolving into confusion, then grudging compliance. As Thorne retreated, Jackson turned back to Scarlett. "You do not belong here," he said, not as a judgment of her worth, but of the environment itself. He reached across the table and gently picked up her hand again, his thumb rubbing the faint, permanent calluses on her palm. "You belong somewhere that recognizes the true cost of effort, not just the fleeting value of assets." The closeness was too much. The scent of his expensive cologne, the warmth of his hand, the dangerous, explicit acknowledgement of her hidden self, it was a promise and a threat. "This is where I must be," Scarlett whispered, pulling her hand back reluctantly, the forbidden nature of their connection now palpable. "My duty is here." Jackson simply nodded, his eyes troubled. He reached into his pocket, not for a tip, but for something else. He placed a small, antique silver key, ornate and clearly valuable, on the table, nestled where the financial report had been. "My private study on the 50th floor of the Alistair Towers," he said, his voice dropping to a near inaudible murmur. "The one place in this city where the rules of class do not apply. I keep it unlocked only when I know you are downstairs." He paused, his gaze burning into hers. "I need you to bring me the truth, Scarlett. The real truth about what is driving you. Tomorrow night, find your way up, past the security. The key is your permission." The simple silver key was a heavy, audacious invitation, a direct crossing of the social line, a leap into the complete unknown. It was a challenge and a confession. Jackson Alistair was not just acknowledging her presence. He was inviting her into the heart of his empire, into the deepest sanctuary of his secrets. Holding the key felt like holding a volatile, burning ember. She had been invited to walk through fire. The unspoken question was she brave enough to defy the rules and unlock the secret that Jackson Alistair seemed determined to share? The silver key felt cold and impossibly heavy in Scarlett's apron pocket. It was more than metal. It was a choice, a declaration against the suffocating boundaries of her life. For 24 hours, the decision gnawed at her, a beautiful, terrifying thing. Defying security to enter the private domain of Jackson Alistair was madness, a risk that could cost her the only job she had. But the thought of his eyes, the silent understanding in them, outweighed the fear. He was offering her a momentary escape from the running, a place to simply be. The next night, after her shift ended, Scarlett stood before the colossal, polished doors of Alistair Towers. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and silent power. She slipped the silver key into a nondescript side door, bypassing the biometric scanners and watchful eyes of the main reception. The key turned with a soft, decisive click, and the sound was the first note in a forbidden symphony. Fear is the shadow of desire. She rode the private elevator alone, the ascent to the 50th floor feeling less like a lift and more like a passage between dimensions. When the doors opened, she stepped into silence. The private study was vast, lined with books and glass that offered a dizzying panorama of the sleeping city. Jackson was there, standing by the window, silhouetted against the urban sprawl that he commanded. He wore a simple cashmere sweater, his posture relaxed, the armor of the CEO momentarily shed. "You came," he said, turning, his voice infused with a quiet, profound relief. "The key was compelling," Scarlett replied, trying to sound steady, her hands trembling slightly behind her back. For the next hour, they didn't speak of business, or class, or the restaurant below. They spoke of the things that truly defined them. Jackson spoke of the relentless weight of his legacy, the isolation of power, and a deep-seated guilt he carried. A secret, unresolved sorrow that mirrored the pain she saw in his eyes. He confessed to feeling trapped in the gilded cage he had inherited. Scarlett, in turn, spoke of her sister, Lily, whose illness required specialized care they couldn't afford, the reason for her relentless work, the root of her exhaustion. She spoke of the dream she once had of studying architecture, a cruel irony given Jackson's profession. "You are not a waitress, Scarlett," Jackson murmured, moving closer. "You are an architect of resilience, building a life brick by arduous brick." He reached out, his hand gently sweeping a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch was exquisitely tender, a confirmation that in this private haven, the world's rules had dissolved. The physical tension between them, previously constrained by the watchful eyes of the Gilded Spoon, became an undeniable current. Their silence was a declaration. Just as their connection reached its most vulnerable, most truthful peak, the quiet was brutally shattered. The study door suddenly opened, not the elevator, but a secondary, internal door. A woman walked in, elegant, ice blonde, dressed in the unmistakable couture of the high society. Her eyes, narrowed and furious, went straight to Jackson, then lingering with contempt on Scarlett. "Jackson, I thought you were working late," she said, her voice sharp, laced with a familiar, proprietary authority. She didn't wait for an answer, focusing her attention back on Scarlett with a chillingly polite smile. "And who is this?" "Oh, the catering staff. Dear, I believe your shift ended an hour ago. You should really learn the rules of propriety here." Scarlett felt the blood drain from her face. She recognized the woman. Evelyn Sterling, Jackson's longtime associate, rumored to be his fiancée, the perfect counterpart to the Alistair dynasty. The sight of Evelyn standing there, territorial and cold, was a physical manifestation of the boundaries Scarlett had foolishly dared to cross. The true cost of the forbidden love slammed into her. Jackson immediately stepped forward, placing himself slightly between the two women. "Evelyn, this is highly inappropriate. Scarlett is here at my invitation." "An invitation to the study, Jackson?" Evelyn's voice dropped, venomous and precise. "Or an invitation to something more easily replaced? Your father warned you about these little charities. They only cause trouble." She didn't acknowledge Scarlett as a person, only as a mistake, a low-stakes diversion. And then came the blow, the single, devastating comment that created the fatal fissure. Evelyn didn't wait for Jackson to defend Scarlett. She looked directly into Scarlett's eyes, her smile predatory. "You truly believe he brought you up here for the truth, dear?" Jackson has a long history of collecting lost causes. It makes him feel less guilty about the foundation scandals. It's always a pity project before the big merger. And you, little waitress, are the perfect, tragic narrative. The word scandal hit Scarlett with the force of a physical impact. She looked back at Jackson, searching his eyes for denial, for rage at the slander. But the wound she had seen earlier, the guilt, the unresolved sorrow, seemed to deepen and darken under Evelyn's accusation. He looked conflicted, devastated, but importantly, he did not offer a complete, absolute denial of Evelyn's veiled threat. A sudden, terrible comprehension settled like ash. The silence was Scarlett's verdict. The unspoken truth of Evelyn's words, that she was merely a means to an end, a distraction, a way for the billionaire to assuage some deep corporate guilt, crushed the fragile hope the key had represented. She had climbed 50 floors for a moment of truth, only to find the cruelest lie. She wasn't an escape for him, she was an easy anecdote. She felt the crushing, humiliating weight of the betrayal. She didn't wait for Jackson's explanation, which she now suspected would be a carefully crafted evasion. She simply turned, her eyes burning with unshed tears, and walked directly to the elevator. "Scarlett, wait! It's not what she implies, I swear." Jackson called after her, his voice hoarse, but it was too late. She punched the lobby button, the descent beginning instantly. As the door hissed shut, she looked back one last time. Jackson stood there, his hand outstretched, a portrait of agonizing conflict, but the image was already overlaid with the shadow of Evelyn Sterling's cold triumph. Scarlett's forbidden journey had ended exactly where it had begun, alone in the darkness, but now carrying the fresh, searing pain of having believed in a light that was never meant for her. The silver key, once a symbol of hope, felt like a burning brand of her own naivety. The architecture of their forbidden love had collapsed, and she was left falling back into the shadows. The separation was absolute, agonizing, and fueled by a brutal, crushing misunderstanding. The weeks that followed Scarlett's disastrous flight from the 50th floor were shrouded in a thick, painful silence. The Gilded Spoon resumed its normal rhythm, but for Scarlett, the ambience was heavy with the ghost of Jackson's presence. She avoided his private table, opting for the chaotic, bustling kitchen service, desperate to bury the humiliation and the heartache beneath the noise of clanging pots and hurried orders. Jackson Alistair, predictably, disappeared from the establishment, his absence a confirmation of Evelyn's cruel narrative. The pity project was over. Scarlett was left with a cold, hard kernel of self-recrimination. She had allowed herself to believe in a narrative that defied gravity, only to be crushed by the reality of the social order. The silver key lay hidden beneath her meager possessions, a constant, sharp reminder of her folly. Trust is the highest form of betrayal when misplaced. The inevitable collision occurred not in the refined halls of the restaurant, but in the desolate, forgotten corner of a city hospital. Scarlett was rushing between work and her sister Lily's specialized ward, the sole reason for her relentless sacrifice. She was leaning against a vending machine, trying to swallow a tasteless coffee, when she heard a low, familiar voice around the corner. It was Jackson. He wasn't in a suit, but in muted, serious clothing, his face haggard with deep exhaustion, standing outside the oncology wing. He wasn't speaking to a board member or a client. He was speaking quietly, intensely, to a doctor. Scarlett froze, unable to move, rooted to the spot by the sheer, unexpected intimacy of seeing him in the setting. She listened, inadvertently becoming privy to the deepest, most carefully guarded secret of the Alistair dynasty. Jackson was asking about a complex, experimental treatment. The patient wasn't him. It wasn't Evelyn. It was a name that made Scarlett's heart stop. Elias Alistair, Jackson's younger, estranged brother. Elias was the hidden reason Jackson carried that deep-seated guilt, the source of the unresolved sorrow she had glimpsed in his eyes. The doctor mentioned the prohibitive cost of the trial drug, emphasizing that the Alistair Foundation's current legal issues, the scandals Evelyn had mentioned, were delaying access to the necessary funds. The financial reports Jackson had been studying that night were not about a merger, but about the desperate measures he was taking to secure the impossible financing for his brother. The truth hit Scarlett like a physical wave, stripping away the months of misunderstanding and pain. Evelyn's words, "It makes him feel less guilty about the Foundation scandals. It's always a pity project before the big merger," suddenly clicked into their devastating context. Evelyn had twisted the complex, painful truth of Jackson's brother's illness and the Foundation's legal battles to sound like corporate indifference. Jackson hadn't been denying the scandals, he had been silently protecting the reason for them. The Foundation's financial maneuverings, which were being called scandalous by the press, were Jackson's high-stakes gamble to save Elias. The greatest lie is a half-truth told with malice. Scarlett waited until the doctor left, her entire body shaking with a tumultuous mix of realization and regret. She walked around the corner, her uniform still smelling faintly of roasted garlic and steam, and stood before Jackson. He looked up, startled, his gray eyes widening in shock, then instantly hardening into weary resignation. "I heard," Scarlett whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I heard everything. Elias." Jackson sighed, his shoulders slumping. He looked away, embarrassed by the exposure of his private battle. "I knew the moment I saw you there. You weren't supposed to see this. This is the part of my life I keep hidden, even from myself." "Evelyn, she made it sound like I was a toy, a distraction from a merger," Scarlett said, the old hurt mixing with the new, raw understanding. Jackson finally met her eyes, and the pain in his gaze was unbearable. "She is a shield, Scarlett. The perfect, cold front my board and my father demand. She knows the truth, or at least a version of it, and she uses it as a weapon." He took a step toward her. "When she walked in, I was faced with a choice: defend the truth of my brother's situation and expose him to my ruthless inner circle, or protect the family secret and let you leave, thinking the worst of me." "And you chose the secret," Scarlett finished, the old pride rising. "You chose to protect your world and let my heart be collateral damage. It was not a choice of heart, but of duty." Jackson's voice rose, raw and strained. "Elias is fighting for his life. Evelyn is the daughter of a key investor. Exposing her lie means destroying the foundation's fragile stability and cutting off the last possible lifeline to Elias's treatment. My duty is to him, Scarlett, above everything. Even above the chance I thought I had with you." The confrontation was brutal, a tearing open of wounds. It wasn't about love versus duty, but duty versus duty, heart versus duty. Scarlett saw the man beneath the billionaire facade, a desperate, grieving brother making an impossible, agonizing choice. Love is the truth you choose to carry, even if it weighs you down. Scarlett looked at Jackson, not with judgment, but with a sudden, overwhelming surge of shared burden. She understood sacrifice. She understood the lengths to which one would go for family. Lily was her Elias. She reached out, tentatively, not to touch him, but to point to the large, framed donation plaque on the hospital wall. "Alistair Foundation," she read quietly. "The same foundation they call scandalous in your reports." Jackson simply nodded, his eyes glistening. "The scandal is the price of keeping my brother's fight private, and the price of keeping you safe from the vultures." Scarlett's heart cracked open, the bitterness dissolving into profound compassion. She took a final step toward him, crossing the professional boundary they had both respected since the fall. She placed her hand, still slightly rough from work, gently on his arm. It was a gesture of solidarity, not romance. "I may just be the waitress everyone mocks, Jackson," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But I know what it means to carry that weight. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." His composure finally shattered. He gripped her hand, his relief palpable, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting, desperate moment. This wasn't a romantic reconciliation. It was the raw, necessary convergence of two isolated souls, united by the fierce, protective duty to their respective siblings. The weight hadn't disappeared, but for the first time it was shared. The truth was out, the choice had been explained, and the immense, crushing burden of their separate struggles had finally, momentarily, found a single, fragile point of connection. They were still standing on opposite sides of an impossible class divide, but the shared pain had bridged the gap. Now, the final, terrifying question remained: could their love survive the sheer weight of their duties? The hospital corridor became their unlikely sanctuary. It was far from the polished arrogance of the Gilded Spoon and the cold height of the Alistair Towers, but here, among the sterile sounds and the hushed urgency of medical life, they found a brutal honesty that wealth and poverty had previously obscured. Scarlett and Jackson no longer met under the pretense of servitude or secret meetings. They met as equals in sacrifice, bound by the fragile hope for their siblings. The next few weeks were a blur of shared strategy. Scarlett's intimate knowledge of the city's working class and its hidden networks, the very world Jackson's empire often overlooked, proved invaluable. She helped him navigate the bureaucratic labyrinth surrounding the charitable distribution of the foundation's funds, finding ways to ensure the experimental drug reached Elias without tipping off the board members loyal to Evelyn. The forbidden love that had started with a touch and a key was now fueled by a quiet, dangerous collaboration. Jackson, in turn, used his resources to move Lily into a private, specialized wing, ensuring the best care was provided without a word spoken about payment. He didn't offer a handout. He offered partnership, recognizing the immense cost of her dedication. The resolution of the story was not found in a grand declaration of love, but in the acceptance of their shared realities. The pressure on the Alistair Foundation finally broke. The legal battles became public, and though Jackson saved Elias, the cost was immense. He was forced to step down as CEO, ceding control to his father's more conservative associates, including Evelyn, who executed her corporate power play with cold precision. Jackson Alistair, the king of Crestwood, lost his throne. For Scarlett, the outcome was different. Lily, stabilized and now in long-term recovery, no longer required her constant, punishing sacrifice. The financial burden was lifted. She was finally free to reclaim her own life. Their meeting took place on the public steps of the Crestwood Museum, a neutral ground between their old lives. Jackson wore clothes that were expensive but understated. He carried no briefcase, no aura of untouchable power, only the quiet dignity of a man who had faced the true cost of his duties and survived. Scarlett was no longer in her waitress uniform. She wore a simple dress, her shoulders straighter, her eyes clear, shining with the hard-won light of her own future. "I have lost the towers," Jackson said, a faint, bittersweet smile touching his lips. "But I have kept the integrity of the foundation, and Elias is stable. I am truly, finally, free of the gilded cage. But to find myself, I must leave Crestwood. I need to build something new, far from these shadows." "And I have stopped running," Scarlett replied, meeting his gaze with unshed tears. "I'm applying to the architecture program. The one I abandoned to save Lily." They stood at a crossroads, two ships charting radically different courses. Jackson was leaving to redefine his legacy abroad. Scarlett was staying to build her future from the ground up. "We traded our roles, didn't we?" Jackson observed, his voice thick with emotion. "I go to find freedom, you stay to build it." He reached out, taking her hand one last time. The touch was familiar, grounding, and full of profound respect. "This isn't a goodbye, Scarlett. It's a pause. Build your skyscrapers. Reach for the sky. And when you are ready, look for me. The greatest act of love is the courage to let go, so you can grow." Jackson released her hand and walked away, disappearing into the stream of humanity. Scarlett didn't chase him. She turned toward the city, her heart aching but full of hope, ready to design her own skyline. 5 years later, the city of Crestwood had changed. In the heart of the district where Scarlett once lived in poverty, a magnificent new structure stood, the Lilly Center for Arts and Design. It was a building made of glass and light, open to everyone, a direct architectural rebellion against the closed doors of the Alistair Towers. Scarlett stood in the center of the atrium, reviewing blueprints. She was no longer the tired waitress with the ill-fitting uniform. She was the lead architect, a woman radiating power, grace, and accomplishment. "The design is flawless," a deep, familiar voice rumbled from behind her. "But I expected nothing less from the woman who sees the world so clearly." Scarlett froze. The blueprints trembled in her hands. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Standing there was Jackson. He looked different. The lines of worry were gone, replaced by a rugged, healthy vitality. He wasn't the stressed billionaire king anymore. He was a man who had found peace. "You came back," Scarlett whispered, the breath leaving her lungs. Jackson smiled, walking toward her, his steps echoing on the polished floor she had designed. "I heard the most brilliant architect in the city was unveiling her masterpiece. I couldn't miss it." He stopped directly in front of her, his gray eyes soft and full of undimmed adoration. "I spent 5 years building schools across the ocean, Scarlett, but I never built a home, because my home was always standing right here." He reached out, and just like that first night at the Gilded Spoon, he took her hand. But this time, her hand wasn't rough from labor, and his wasn't heavy with guilt. They were equals. "You're not running anymore," Jackson murmured, his thumb brushing her knuckles. "No," Scarlett smiled, tears of pure joy spilling over. "I was waiting for you." Jackson pulled her close, and as they kissed in the center of the light-filled building she had created, the past dissolved. The waitress and the billionaire were gone. In their place stood two survivors, two architects of their own destiny who had dared to lose everything to find themselves, and in the end, found each other again. The city lights outside glittered, no longer a cage, but a celebration. Their love story hadn't ended on the museum steps. It had simply been under construction. And now, it was finally complete.